responding to aggressive behavior. One of the most demanding and stressful situations that we face is the aggressive and defiant behaviors. The teachers of students with EBD list that as the major source of job-related stress. It's very, very stressful when there's a kid that's behaving aggressively and that you don't know what to do. And there are so many, there's such a shortage of teachers, especially good teachers, that we want to do everything we can and learn as much as we can to eliminate more stress so that we can keep teachers here, the ones that care and are doing their jobs and, you know, that are helping the children that we have here. And we're having more and more students that are being identified as EBD or just have behavioral issues. And EBD does not just include those children that have emotional or behavioral disorder ruling, but also those kids that have sensory issues, that are, you can come in, that have sensory issues that are diagnosed as autism or any of those sensory related disorders. Aggressive behavior can be categorized in the acting out behavior of a hostile aggressive student. We have three general categories. We have verbal aggression, physical aggression, and vandalism. What distinguishes the behavior as hostile is if it is done with the intent to harm, whether that be physical, emotional, or revenge or retaliation. Just because they do something that we would consider aggressive, if they do it without malicious intent, then it is not categorized as aggressive or hostile behavior. And that normally is going to fall into some of those severe disabilities, those kids who they don't necessarily have the intent behind their behavior. So when you look at some of the statistics, all of those statistics come from the Civil Rights Office. They pull all those data reports, and that's where they distinguish those behaviors. Physical aggression is the most common form of challenging behavior experienced by the staff members, and the presence of aggressive behavior is the most frequent reason for referrals to the specialist. Like we have our behavior specialist. We refer for a lot of reasons, but that physical aggression is the most common. That can be, physical aggression can be not just hitting, but the hitting, kicking, spitting, throwing, and material. If they throw anything with the intent to harm somebody, biting, those can all be considered physical aggression. Verbal aggression can include defiance, arguing, threats, swearing, sarcasm and teasing, and vandalism is not just when they destroy property, but also theft. They categorize that as vandalism also. What causes aggressive behavior in children? The exact cause of aggressive behavior is not known, obviously, because we don't know why some students behave the way they do and some children don't. But there are theories as to why students display aggressive behavior. One of the theories is modeling, peer reinforcement, social skills deficit, and low self-esteem. Our children model what they see. If they see aggressive behavior at home, if they see it from the teachers here at school, if they see it in the media, they see it on their games, that Grand Theft Auto that they all talk about on a play. When they see that aggressive behavior, they do mimic it, even more so when you have a student with developmental disabilities. That's their primary way to gain knowledge and to figure out how to act is to model somebody else. And when that's what they're seeing, that's what they're going to do. If they receive threats from their parents, they're constantly being yelled at, they see violence among their peers. If they live in a neighborhood, they ride a bus where they see a lot of violence, yelling, screaming, and that gets somebody what they want, then that's what they're going to do. They're going to model the behavior. It says teachers need to be aware if we're modeling aggressive behaviors. Occasionally we may do that even without realizing that we do. I know I do sometimes. I get overwhelmed, frustrated, stressed out, and I don't realize that what I'm modeling is aggressive behaviors. Also, we have to look at and be aware of if when students act aggressively, are we reinforcing their behavior? If we model that that aggressive behavior will get a child what they want, then that's going to lead to other children responding aggressively because they learn that if I act a fool, I'm gonna get what I want, so now I'm acting a fool because that child did. So it says just to be aware of those things. And that doesn't always have to be getting what they want. It can be attention from the staff or peers, or escaping something they didn't want to do. Anytime they receive what it is that they want, then that is going to be a positive reinforcement to them, and they're going to continue to do that behavior because it worked. It worked the first time, and the next time they're going to do it, and it's going to get worse. Peer reinforcement. Behavior such as fighting, it can be reinforced by peers, like when they take sides. When the other kids in the class start taking sides, and one kid, has more children on their side, that's going to reinforce that behavior. It leads to increased aggressive behavior in the classroom when you just have that environment and that atmosphere. And social skills deficits. Children who are delayed in social skills, they do act more aggressively because they do not have the skills necessary to express what it is that they want. That is their problem solving skills. It's the only tool that they have, is to behave aggressively so that they can get what it is they want. And aggressive students, they exhibit the deficits in social information processing. It's because they misinterpret social cues or misassign hostility to others, and it's usually when they're stressed out. For example, if you have a kid, an aggressive student or a student with EBD in the hallway, every time somebody bumps into them or looks at them, they're thinking that kid was trying to push them, or they were looking at them wrong, and they assign that blame and intent to others that wasn't there because they just don't know. They often feel threatened and become defensive even when there is no threat, even if it didn't exist. Their social skills deficits of these students include poor impulse control, low frustration tolerance, limited ability to generate alternative responses, and they don't understand the feelings of others. Responding to aggressive behavior. It says staff attitudes and behavior may be the most important factor affecting aggressive behavior. There's something that I read in my textbook that I didn't put on the slide because it was a whole lot to write. But it really, when I was reading through it, it really made me think. When we are teaching our children and we have a classroom, when we get their grades back, if all of our children are struggling academically, then we will look at ourselves and we'll be a little bit more reflective on what can I do, how can I teach differently, what have I done to where they didn't understand the lesson. We will look to see what can I do to help them. A lot of times when there's a behavioral problem in our classroom, instead of looking to see what we can do to fix it, we immediately get emotional and defensive and think, well, that kid's just crazy, they need to change. Sometimes we do need to look, we need to look at ourselves with the behavioral problems the same way we do with the academic. If there's a shortfall in their behavioral, in the way that the children behave, we need to treat it just like we do the academic and try to remove the emotions from it. It's hard to do, but the attitude that we use is going to affect that aggressive behavior. It's also important that the person directly involved with the student be actively involved in the response to the aggressive behavior. Constantly sending them to the office is not going to be the most effective way to deal with aggressive behavior. A lot of our children who display aggressive behavior at some point in their life, they come from broken homes, they feel abandoned, and they have all of those feelings. If you constantly refer them to an administrator or another specialist, they can perceive the fact that the teacher does not care enough about them to solve the problem. They get into a habit of thinking, nobody likes me, nobody cares, and they're going to leave. So what they do is they assume that you're going to leave and give up on them if they can just figure out where your breaking point is, and they're going to keep pushing until they find out where that point is. And then, it's almost like reaffirming that they were right. So I'm not saying the book doesn't say don't use administrators because that's what they're there for, and the behavior specialists, there are times we need help, but don't let that be the first thing that you do. We want to make sure that whoever is going to be directly involved with that student is actively involved in the response to the aggressive behavior. Modeling self-control. Teachers who respond in a calm, positive manner have fewer problems with student behavior. That's not always easy to do. I know with my students, I get up and I will talk really fast and I get nervous and I'm always in a hurry because I'm stressed out. And they will tell me, why are you rushing? Because it stresses them out. And I have to take a step back, take a deep breath, and realize I need to be a little more calm. If you respond to aggressive situations in a calm, positive manner, it encourages the child to accept responsibility for their behavior. Jim Fay and David Funk in 1995, they say that the important point is that when teachers fail to respond calmly, they allow the student to place the responsibility for the conflict on the adult, which is very true. If we don't respond calmly and we get upset, then the focus is then not on what did the child do wrong, but then how did you respond inappropriately. If we want them to take responsibility for their actions, then we're gonna have to do our best to remain calm. And I think about that with my children, my personal children. When they've done wrong, if I overreact and I get upset, then I feel bad, so then I go back to them and I apologize for my behavior instead of focusing on what I needed them to do differently. And so the main thing is we wanna try to model self-control. Prepare yourself and your students for situations that may be difficult. If there are changes in the routine that you know are going to be a challenge for your students, discuss them with your students in advance. Activities that produce stress, anxiety, or frustration, they're going to increase the disruptive or aggressive behavior. We know what those things are. I have a student who every single time he cannot go to specials during case testing, he gets very upset because his schedule is different and he will have to call Mr. Gill on the phone and have a whole explanation on why he cannot go to computer. But I know if we do that before we get to specials, then we're not going to have a meltdown during specials. If we don't do that, we're going to spend all the specials in the calm down room screaming and throwing stuff. Just simple little things that you can do to prepare them when you know what those stresses are for your students. Build a positive relationship bank account. Students are less likely to respond violently in the presence of an adult whom they respect and whom they think cares about them. This takes time, but it does make a difference with your students. The longer that you spend with them and that you let them know that you care about them and that you love them and you want them to be successful, just telling them those things as many times as you can when they're doing the correct behavior, it will help. Strategies for building positive relationship with students include just demonstrating an interest in their activities, eating lunch with them, which we already do here, having informal conversations with the students, and joining in games at recess. Things like that will go a long way with the students. They want to know that you care. I mean, and if they do, then they're going to work a whole lot harder with you. Respond thoughtfully with a purpose to de-escalate behavior. Responding thoughtfully requires an awareness of early warning signs with students. Early warning signs can be things like they stop working, refusing to talk, looking angry or upset, making comments under their breath, looking anxious or depressed. Some of our students, when they start acting that way, we know that signals that they're gonna have a bad day and aggressive behavior is coming. Don't ignore it if you know that student well enough to know that you need to intervene. Sometimes just intervening early and validating their feelings is going to help, minimize those aggressive behavior outbursts. This is a list of things that you can do to respond thoughtfully. And just ensure your nonverbal cues are non-threatening. Sometimes we don't think about that. I catch myself doing that all the time. I cross my arms and when I'm talking to my students, and you don't think about that, but especially with some of these autistic students, that is threatening to them. I mean, that does not feel like, it feels like you're mad at them, and if they think you're angry, they're gonna stop listening. Make your request clearly and firmly, and identify the feelings the student may be experiencing by actively listening. Use iMessages. Don't constantly tell the student, well, you did this and you did that, and I need you to do this. Change it into, how do you feel? I feel like you didn't try your best. Change it to iMessages because it doesn't feel like you're attacking them when you use the iMessage statements. Offer assistance. They don't usually have, children who are constantly display aggressive behavior usually do not have the skill sets necessary to think of options or things that they could do differently in certain situations. So provide those options for them, predict a positive choice in its outcome. Tell them a way they could have handled the situation and a way it could have turned out and one that's positive. And walk away. Like, that is where I'm talking about you need to know your students. Sometimes the student just needs space and they do need you to leave them alone. A three-phase approach. The three-phase approach is to validate the student's feelings and to remember, because sometimes when we're teachers, we think that trying to understand a child and talking to them about their behavior is going to signal to them that we accept it. And attempting to understand a student's behavior is not the same as accepting their behavior. You can try to understand why they feel and act the way they do without accepting it and telling them, and affirming that it's right. Provide choices and options for the student is phase 2. Children who behave aggressively, normally most of the interaction they have with adults is being told what to do or to receive immediate punishment. When they're upset, they can't think of options, and they need skill training to help them make better choices in the future. That's something that they have to practice, and we need to continue to do that. Don't try to do that when they're upset and they're in the middle of a meltdown. You come back to them later when they have calmed down and the situation is different. Go over the problem, talk to them about it, talk about options, ways they could have done it differently. And to end the exchange on a positive note, aggressive students and students suffering from EBD, most of the time they are going to misinterpret and overreact to feedback. You have to end it on a positive note, because anything that could even be construed as negative is all they're going to hear. So it's very important that you end it on a positive note. The specific strategies for aggressive or violent children are to reduce access to possible victims and minimize competition. If you have a whole lot of extremely aggressive children in a classroom and you're constantly having them compete against each other, that is not going to end well. I'm not saying that we can't use it as a tool in our classrooms. You just want to minimize it with those aggressive children. Establish expectations for the classroom. The clearer that your expectations are for those students on what it is you want them to do, then the less stress they're going to have, because they're not going to constantly be anxious about what it is that you expect from them. Avoid confrontation. Use nonverbal signs and reminders. Intervene early with problems. Provide highly preferred activities for reinforcements, and use non-aggressive consequences such as timeout, response calls, when you take a point away from them, or you take a coin away from them, or whatever the point system is or whatever classroom management strategy you have in your classroom. I put this in here because there are times that they talk about restraint and seclusion with aggressive behavior. We don't typically use a whole lot of it in the schools, but when we do, we don't really know what it is, because there's not a whole lot of information about it. And I realized that there were a lot of things that I didn't understand about it. But I put the definition on here from the U.S. Department of Education, because they're the ones that have the policies and procedures. MDE does have a copy of this on their website, because we do follow the same policies and procedures as the U.S. Department of Education, because Mississippi does not have its own separate state policies and procedures on restraint and seclusion. Restraint only, there are more than one type. I only put the definition of physical restraint, because inside a school setting, we would never use mechanical restraint. That would be inside a clinic or a facility in which they have the means to do that. We do not. The restraint is only a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move his or her torso, arms, legs, or head freely. The term physical restraint does not include a physical escort or temporarily touching or holding the hand of a child, the wrist, arm, shoulder, back, for the purpose of inducing that student to walk to a safe location. So that is not physical restraint. That is when you physically escort a student. Occasionally we may have that here, but we do not typically use any really restraints. But mechanical, we do not use at all. And seclusion, as defined by the Department of Education, is involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room or area for which the student is prevented from leaving. It does not include a timeout, which is a behavior management technique that is part of a program. It involves monitoring the separation of a student in a non-locked setting and is implemented for the purpose of calming. What we do here is not seclusion, it is timeout. It is only considered seclusion if they are kept separate for longer than 20 minutes and they are physically prevented from leaving the room. So when we, the things that we use here would be considered timeout. And I think it works this time.
Fighting and aggression are among the most serious and challenging of all student behaviors. These include all instances in which one or more students engage in behavior whose sole purpose is to deliver physical or emotional harm to another. In milder cases, the teacher's goal is to interrupt the aggression, but in the most extreme cases, the focus is solely on the safety of all concerned to the greatest degree possible. Let's watch an example of fighting and aggressive behavior and see whether the teacher addressed them effectively.
Move or I'm gonna punch you, okay?
Wow, that's really scary.
Guys, every day the same thing, whining about who gets what chair. It's like a couple of babies. Figure it out.
I agree, he is a baby.
Well, figure it out.
You know what? I'm not gonna ask you one more time. Find another seat.
In this scenario, the teacher realizes that these two students are likely to have a problem with regard to seating arrangements, but has done nothing to create an environment in which this can be prevented.
Kid's face.
Every kid would have about that. He's like he in World 5.
Instead, making a vague statement about figuring it out. Even after there has been a partial physical conflict, the teacher takes no steps to implement a crisis plan or redirect the students. The final response by the student was to actually shove the other student, an outcome that quite possibly could have been avoided if the teacher were to have been involved. The simplest solution to the scenario, when the teacher realizes that the desk is a predictor for an argument between these two students, is to change the environment in a way that prevents the conflict, such as creating a seating chart. However, the following scenario provides an example of a response to an altercation that has already begun.
If you don't move, I'm gonna punch you.
Wow, that's really scary. I'm shaking.
Guys, look, we have a seating chart. Who's supposed to be sitting right here?
Me.
I've been sitting here for forever.
Alright, here's what let's do for today. We're gonna flip a coin to see who does this, but for right now, why don't you just sit at my desk? It's got the swivel chair, it's comfortable. Go over there.
Okay.
Right.
I'll sit there.
I know you wanted to sit here today, we'll flip a coin for the future, but this is where we'll be today.
In this solution, the teacher intervened early and provided a redirection. When the first option did not work, the teacher provided another and was able to get the students to focus on the new seating option instead of their current conflict.
Okay. That was just an example of some of the things that we had talked about earlier in the aggressive behavior that we could see in a classroom. Sometimes you can't just ignore the behavior, and just intervening early, redirecting the student, and just something very simple can change the outcome. And also, don't forget the positive. It's important to note the positive outcomes. It's really easy that, you know, when we have negative things going on in our classrooms, especially if they're extreme, then we have to document, so we're good about doing that. But we fail to document the good days, and with some kids, we need to document the good hours or the good minutes, because that's all you're gonna get. If there's ever a moment's peace in the classroom, you need to look at the antecedents, the behaviors, and the consequences of that event also, just like you would for the disruptive behaviors or the behaviors that you wanna change. And make sure that you're reinforcing incompatible behaviors. If you have a student who is behaving in a way that's incompatible, then you wanna make sure that you are constantly reinforcing that behavior, and sometimes we forget. It's just, you know, we recognize students' improvement and reinforce it, but too often we fall in the trap of responding to the negative behavior and forgetting to recognize the positive, especially with students who are typically aggressive or EBD students, because we forget to, you know, recognize those behaviors, or because they're typical, that's what we expect to see or how we want people to act. So we forget to, recognize that for them, that was a big accomplishment, that they are behaving. And so make sure that we're focusing on that positive, because a lot of them, their reason that they're behaving is they're not behaving is they want that attention. So the more attention that we give them for doing good, the better off we're gonna be. And that was it. Appreciate y'all listening.